And now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's fashion, Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And now, here's Ted.
Thank you so much, Becky, and Happy New Year, one and all. Welcome to 2024. We've made it to another year, and we thank you for being with us and supporting us this past, what's it been, a year and a half now, I guess. Yeah, over that. And thanks for suggesting us to your friends and your family. We appreciate that. And if you'd like to join us, you can do so online. It's www.tedwallachin.ca. You can leave your comments and questions for us. We get back to everybody as soon as we possibly can. As well, you can listen to past episodes, all 100 and something happen to exist at this point. Now, this week's episode features a gentleman who recently celebrated his 1000th episode of his iconic radio show / podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, a program revered by musicians and those who enjoy music. In other words, everybody. During his 40-plus years, he has entertained listeners right across Canada, in fact, right around the world. He has recorded 4 audiobooks and written a children's book titled The Science of Song. His latest venture launched this past fall. It's called Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. Alan Cross, it's great to see you. I think the last time that you and I chatted, you were asking me the questions, and I was sitting on a stool at the El Macombo. We were talking about the history of CFNY, the documentary that you're working on. How's that coming along?
It's coming along very well. We have to have what's called picture lock by the end of the year. We did a little bit of filming yesterday to get some connective tissue to tell the rest of the story. For example, we actually went out to Brampton 10 days before picture lock. We went out to Brampton. And we visited the site of the old Little Yellow House. We went to 83 Kennedy Road South, and we wrapped up by having dinner at Calypso Garden, which, of course, was in the mall at 83 Kennedy Road South, and the place that used to sell us beers to go for years.
Yeah.
Highly illegal, but it was fun.
I loved working at 83 Kennedy Road because I was doing an hour-long talk show, and we would book guests. And like 5 minutes before the show started, we'd get this panic call from a publicist saying, "We're at 83 Kennedy Road and I don't see any radio station." "Are you in Scarborough?" "Yes." "No, we're the other Kennedy Road. We're the one in Brampton, like 45 minutes across the 401. Well, now an hour and 45 minutes across the 401. Oh, God.
That happens a lot with not only with you, but with bands who would come from the airport or come from somewhere and end up in Scarborough instead of Brampton.
Any idea when this documentary may be released?
Well, so the next thing that we have to do is after picture lock, which means that the edit is done, we have to license the music and sync the music to the various points in the film. And I guess that's it. We would like to have a trailer ready for sometime early Q2 of 2024. And then we will try and sell it. The production company has a couple of lines on things. There should be a trailer in time for Canadian Music Week. There's talk about hot docs, and then there's talk about TIFF for next year. So there are some possibilities, and we'll pursue all of them.
Cool.
Looks like it's going to be about 90 minutes.
Yeah. Well, that means there's a lot of people going to be lying on the cutting room floor then.
I'm afraid so, yes. You not, because you're one of the first people we see in the film. I'll just let you know that.
Oh. So that means I can leave early.
Yeah, you can. You can leave after, I think, 7 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, fine, perfect. I wouldn't do that. I'm looking forward to it because it's CFNY, the Spirit of Radio, is one of those fascinating radio stations in the history of radio in this country, and we'll talk more about it when it comes out. And I'm looking forward to doing that and to seeing it as well. I want to talk a little bit about the things that you're doing, but I want to talk a little bit about Alan Cross. For people not familiar with the work that you did, you were one of those people where it was predetermined that you were going to be in radio. At the age of 6, your grandfather gives you a transistor radio. You got an uncle who works servicing jukeboxes, who drops off a box of records for you. And it was like, okay, it's like the gods are saying, you get the point? Here, do something with it.
Yeah, the problem was, though, I had no intention of being a DJ. I wanted to do my parents proud, and they thought that a DJ was a less than reputable
Yes.
occupation.
Yes.
Long haired, dope smoking, fast talking DJs.
Yeah.
So I had this idea that I was going to be a journalist, an anchor, a foreign correspondent, some kind of news person. And I went on that assumption until I finally got to be a news person with my first full-time radio job in Kenora, Ontario. And within hours, I realized that I hated it. I just hated it. And I lasted 23 days in that position at CJRL in Kenora. And then I fortunately got a job offer at a radio station in Brandon, Manitoba. I left. I tell this story all the time. I left Kenora so fast that my landlord sent the sheriff after me for non-payment of rent.
Wow.
Yeah, and then I've been playing records and talking on the radio ever since.
So you go from Brandon, you go to Winnipeg to Q94, which is a big step up.
It was a big step up. I mean, if you remember what it was like. I mean, Winnipeg was considered to be a major market, and to go from Brandon, Manitoba, 35,000 people, to Winnipeg, which was one of the 10 largest cities in the country, therefore a major market, and it was like, yeah, I mean, this is great. And it was it was an adult contemporary station, which meant lots of Whitney Houston, lots of Huey Lewis in the News, lots of the slow, sappy, female friendly stuff that a 23-year-old probably had no business playing. But I was a radio person more than I was a music person. So I took the job, worked there all night. The all night show. Well, I think I was a year and a half doing that, which was the worst time of my life. Can you imagine working all nights at a radio station in Winnipeg in January?
No, I did it in Montreal.
Well, you know what it's like then, because you go into work, it's dark. You get off work, it's dark. You go to bed, it's dark. You wake up to go to work, and it's dark. And oh God, the vitamin D deprivation that I had, it was awful. And it does terrible things to your mind and your weight and everything else. So fortunately, I was able to work my way up to become music director there. And that at least got me off the all-night shift.
And how did you make your way to Toronto to CFNY, the Spirit of Radio?
There is a weird story. In September of 1986, as the music director, I went into my program director's office with the week's records. Listen to these, maybe we'll put them on the playlist. And I gave him this one song that I was really, really high on. And I said, it's female friendly, it's well produced, the singer is well known, and listen to it. It's just a fantastic song. He took one look at the label and tossed it away and said, no, we're not going to play that because that singer used to be in a rock band, and we don't play rock bands singers solo material. It just doesn't fit with our image. The song was In Your Eyes by Peter Gabriel. And okay, I can't work for this guy anymore. So I did what radio people do. I came in the middle of the night to use station equipment, the station photocopier, stationery, to put together some demo tapes for a couple of radio stations that I hoped would be my escape. The first was K97 in Edmonton, and the other was CFOX in Vancouver. So I come in 2:00 in the morning, and I'm going to use Dan's studio. Dan was friendly to the announcers. He didn't mind us using his production studio. But for the first time ever, Dan's studio was locked. Oh, great. Well, I'll try George's studio down the hall, but I know that George's doesn't like announcers using his stuff, so it's probably locked. But for the first time ever, George's studio was open. Fine. So I'm using this particular studio, and I'm dubbing off the second of 2 demo tapes. I look on the console, and there is a copy of RPM magazine. Do you remember RPM?
Yeah.
Okay. So you know that back in the day, that was the Bible of the Canadian radio and recorded music industry. It came out every week. It was a very expensive subscription, and everything you needed to know about what was happening in the world of Canadian radio and Canadian music was in that weekly little newsletter type thing. because this was pre-internet and everything had to be done this way. So they were such a valuable, that the RPM magazines were so valuable, and we had one copy for the entire station, an AM station, FM station, and all the management. And I, as the music director for the FM station, was in charge of receiving the weekly RPM magazine and keeping track of where each weekly RPM magazine was. And I had sent out a number of memos saying, look, I don't mind you reading RPM, but you got to sign it out from me, because if not, I'm in trouble with management who want to know where their trade magazine is. And there, sitting on the console in George's studio, which was supposed to be locked, was the week's RPM magazine that I hadn't even seen yet. So my thought is, okay, I'm going to have to write another nasty memo and talk to George saying, don't take shit out of my office. So fine, as I'm dubbing off the second cassette, I'm flipping through the magazine, and I come across the classified ads. Jobs available in radio. And I glance through them. The one right at the top was for this radio station in Brampton, Ontario. They were looking for a late evening person, and the job was available immediately. Well, I didn't think I was good enough to work in Toronto, and I certainly didn't know about the music that this radio station played, because I had heard about it, but I didn't know anything about the music. But I looked around, and I had one more manila envelope, one more blank cassette, and just enough postage, which I'll tell you was 76 cents, to mail a third demo tape. So fine, whatever. How could it hurt? I mail off to Edmonton and Vancouver, never heard anything back. I mail off to CFNY in Brampton, and 5 days later, I'm hired. Now, imagine we wouldn't be having this conversation if I had 72 cents worth of stamps, because I wouldn't have bothered. But I had just enough, and as a result, here we are.
Wow. So you were there for how many years? 10, 12 years?
Well, I'm still there, technically.
But you left in...
Right. So it goes like this. I start on October the 3rd, 1986, which is the day that they had the sod turning for the Sky Dome. As a matter of fact, I walked into the building at 12 noon, the very moment the Sky Dome sod turning was happening. So we have that in common. I stayed there doing all nights, and then moving up to middays, and then into afternoons until 2001, just, a basic announcer. And then 2001 to 2004, I was the program director at Y95, then Y108 in Hamilton. Then I moved in 2004 to become the program director at CFNY, 102.1 The Edge. Did that for 4.5 years, and then ended up at in the interactive online division of Chorus from 2008 to 2011. And then that was disbanded, and I was told my services were no longer required. So there was 3 years where I was, Chorus decided that I needed to see other people, and I had no relationship with The Edge. But then in 2014, somebody saw the error of their ways and rehired me back as an independent contractor, and that was 2014. Here's 2023, late 2023, and I'm still there.
Yeah. No, you modestly neglected to say that you were a program director of the year, Canada's program director of the year, 4 years running.
3 or 4, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Well, that was interesting. Cool. When those, I don't know if those, back then, those awards really meant something within the industry. I don't know if they mean as much today because of the state of the radio business, but yeah, that was pretty cool.
So you're working at Chorus, which now owns The Edge, along with Q107 and AM 640, and I guess there's a couple more in there. You put out 4 audiobooks, a children's book called The Science of Song, and was born during that period of time in 1993, I should say. The ongoing history of new music. That concept came from where?
Not from me. No, the radio station had been sold multiple times, and there were many rumors that we were going to flip to country music. But then the new people came in and saw that there was this thing happening with alternative music, with Nirvana and Pearl Jam. And Soundgarden and Red Hot Chili Peppers and Nine Inch Nails and so on. And they did a little bit of market research, and they realized that, you know what, we've got this market already wrapped up. If we just do it a little bit more professionally and with a lot less baggage than the old CFNY days, then we have an opportunity to do really well. And so that's what they did. One of the things that they stipulated, though, was that we were no longer going to be too cool for the room. We were going to be more inclusive with our presentation and with our opinions. You'll remember back in the day, Ted, that it wasn't uncommon for announcers to go on the air and play a song and then slag it.
Yeah.
Or slag somebody else's music. So there was no more of that. And one of the things that they said that, well, if we're going to do this and be more inclusive, what we should do is create a program that explains this music to all these new listeners that we think we're going to get. And they looked around, they found one person on staff with a history degree, which was me. And they called me in one day and said, you are going to do this program. It's going to be once a week. It's going to be called The Ongoing History of New Music. And I thought, well, that's a dumb name. Nobody's ever going to remember it. And not only that, but you won't be working from noon till 6 anymore, Monday to Friday. We're going to actually sever your employment, hire you back as a part-time employee to work Saturday and Sunday mornings from 6 a.m. to noon. Plus, we are going to get you to do this ongoing history of new music program. And you can work on that, Monday to Friday, whenever you feel you need to. And I said to them, this is no, it's not what I want to do. I've got a pretty sweet gig right now. Thank you for the opportunity. But no. And they said, fine, here's another manila envelope. And in it is your terms of severance. And we wish you well in your future endeavors. So not good, considering that being a radio DJ doesn't come with an awful lot of portable skills. And I just got married and just built a house. And so I had no choice but to, take the gig.
Suck it up.
Yeah. So started working on it pre-internet, no books on the subject. All I had were 2 filing cabinets that were filled with press releases from record labels and some newspaper clippings that somebody had actually compiled. And that was the start of everything. And 9 months later, the person that they replaced me with in the afternoons just, wasn't working out. So they said, okay, here's what you're going to do. We're going to bring you back to do afternoons, but you're going to have to still do this program. Okay, fine, deal. Anything beats getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, Saturday and Sunday, and not having a common day off with my wife. So, okay.
Yeah.
And so that's how that started. And then the program, it took about 150 weeks worth of programs before people really started to catch on. But then when it did, it somehow ended up becoming, this Sunday night institution on the radio that people would listen to when they're coming back from the cottage or when they're doing their homework Sunday night or whatever. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And frankly, if it wasn't for this opportunity that I was offered, again, we wouldn't be talking right now, because it has become the basis of everything that I'm doing today. All the books, all the speaking engagements, the continued radio gig, everything. It's all down to that program with the terrible name.
And you just celebrated your 1,000th episode.
Yeah. Think about that for a second. 1,000 episodes of a 1-hour radio documentary in an era when FM regulations in Canada stipulate that you don't have to have any programs like this. Back in the 80s, before sometime in the early 90s, we had to have this thing called foreground programming, which you would know about because you did a foreground program from 9 to 10 every day on CFNY. This was required by our license. We had to talk. People don't understand this today. FM announcers back in the day were required by law to talk more than AM radio announcers, with foreground programming, something called surveillance. There was news programming, and there was something called mosaic programming. So the program continues to survive, even though those FM regulations were abolished sometime in the 90s.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
I've had the great fortune to say that I've been associated with one of Toronto's finest names in men's clothing for more than 25 years, Tom's Place. Founded by Tom Mahalick's father in 1958, Tom's Place offers brand name men's apparel at unbeatable prices. But more than that, they boast a long serving, knowledgeable, and friendly staff that can assist you whether you're looking for casual or formal attire. And they have plenty of first class tailors on site. In addition, Tom and his family are well known for their philanthropic work. So if you're looking to deal with great people who can fulfill your clothing desires at outstanding prices, do yourself a favor and visit Tom's Place. They're open weekdays from 11 to 6, Saturdays 10 to 5, and Sundays noon to 5. You'll find Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market, or check them out online at toms-place.com. Tom's Place will suit you. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866 309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Wallachin.
And now you've got a new project, which I find fascinating when I first heard about, called Uncharted, Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And when I read the title, I immediately started to laugh, not because I thought it was funny, but I thought, well, there's no shortage of any of that in the industry. I mean,
Well, there certainly isn't. Again,
this could be a daily show.
It's again a bit of an unwieldy title, but again, when you're dealing with a podcast, the title has to tell you exactly what you're going to be getting, so you click on it and download it. So this makes sense, and it is a series of programs. Well, every 2 weeks, so it'll be 26 every year. Series of programs that deal with the intersection of crime, bad behavior in the music industry, and there's music in the mob. There's, the time Bob Marley was the attempted assassination of Bob Marley, the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, the big Led Zeppelin heist. There's, what else have I written so far? The disappearance of one of the members of this Manic Street Preachers, which has never been solved. And I've got a long, long, long list of topics. People are now sending these topics in. And if somebody says, hey, you should do something about Alan Klein, the manager of the Rolling Stones, and the guy who helped break up the Beatles through some questionable business tactics. So fantastic. So there'll be lots. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, did he die or was he murdered? Was Kurt Cobain murdered or did he die of a suicide? So yeah, there's a lot going on.
Well, I can even thinking going back to the original payola scandal.
That is included in Music in the Mob. That one is out. Yeah, and there's a lot to talk about there. Not only the payola scandal, but the mob used to run counterfeiting operations with records. They used to control jukeboxes. They used to lean on record companies for various things with something called cutouts. Oh, it's just a mess.
Now, do you deal with like things like, for example, the whole Milli Vanilli fiasco when they found out they were lip syncing during the Grammys or whatever it was? I mean, it was just, and so many musicians, so many artists over the years have recorded albums, and it's not the musicians themselves that are doing it. They're getting this wall of sound, and these great musicians who are doing the actual recording. So when they go out on stage on tour, it's not the same drummer, it's not the same bass player.
Yeah, it's rather interesting. That whole story goes back, to the 1950s when a guy, like Elvis, with a good voice, would come in, record some covers with a band that was supplied to him. And then a band would be hired to go out on the road with him. Of course, we had, his Jordanaires. So the Milli Vanilli one is really interesting. There's a recent documentary on what happened. And if you watch that documentary, you realize that the real villains in that story were not the two guys in Milli Vanilli, but the producer behind them, the guy who perpetrated the fraud. And, back in the early 90s when we were, dumping all over Milli Vanilli, we didn't know the full story. And they got the short end of the stick. They got all the abuse when it should have been this producer, this German producer, who is behind them. And I think that's a good story that should be told. And it can be actually extrapolated to the fact that, when a lot of artists go on tour these days, rock artists, pop artists, hip hop artists, they're not there with a band. They may not even be singing live. They could be the lip syncing because, they're doing all the dancing, they're moving around. I mean, you can't sing and move that physically on stage and not sound like you're out of breath.
I wonder that watching in the past, watching some of the Super Bowl halftime shows, were you thinking, how is this person leaping up all these stairs and not out of breath and continuing to hold notes for 30, 40 seconds? How is that possible?
Yeah. So there is it's happening now too with legacy rock bands. Motley Crue, for example, has been going out on tour, and Vince Neil has a hard time hitting all the notes. So there are accusations that, well, they're just singing to tracks, and they're denying it. AC/DC had the same problem because they went on their last big tour. They went out, and the set list was the same every single night. And fans are saying, we're going to multiple shows. You've got decades and decades of material. Do you have to play the same songs in the same order all the time? And the story I got was, well, yeah, they have to, because otherwise they'd have to go back into the studio and retrack all the vocals so they could perform them live.
Well, in many cases, you get some of the singers, like I believe Frankie Valli, who still performs, and he's in his mid-late 80s. He can't hit some of the notes that he used to hit. So you'll see 5 or 6 background singers, and one of those people can hit those notes. So either his mic goes dead or he just mouths it, and somebody else's personality is coming through who can hit those notes.
Yeah, Ozzy Osbourne used to do that with a guy backstage, decades ago. And if you go see Paul McCartney, seeing Paul McCartney, I'm not going to dump on him, but seeing Paul McCartney is a spiritual experience. It really is something else to see a Paul McCartney concert. But he's 80 years old. He can't hit those notes. He has some crack musicians on stage that help him hit the notes. One of the hardest notes that he has to hit is before they go into the big long coda of Hey Jude, where he goes, he goes up into that high falsetto. Yeah. An 80-year-old man can't hit those notes anymore, but somebody in his 4-piece band can.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, it's, I don't know. I don't think I would consider that to be fraud necessarily.
No, that's padding. There was, when Frank Sinatra was on his last tour, he took out Stephen Eady with him, and Frank would lose the plot. He would forget the lyrics, and it was up to Stephen Eady to, be on stage with him and then pick up where Frank was drifting off. So call it augmentation. I don't consider, at least he was still singing. At least Paul McCartney is still singing and still playing. It's where people don't seem to care now that they're going to see basically a pantomime. It's weird.
Mm-hmm. And what about all these bands that are going out? And in fact, right now we're looking at Randy Bachman and Burton Cummings are suing the Guess Who, or these musicians who are going out performing as the Guess Who.
Yeah,
and that's only one of many examples of groups that are being hired under false pretenses.
Yeah, there are groups like the Ink Spots and the Temptations and Frankie Goes to Hollywood and a whole bunch of others that have been passing themselves off as the real thing when there's not a single live member in the band. Lynyrd Skynyrd right now, still on tour, nobody in the band from the Lynyrd Skynyrd days. Allman Brothers Band, nobody from the original band, and certainly no one named Allman is part of the group. So it is a problem because there's still a market for these legacy bands, but if you show up and it's not the band, Like, what do you do? Trooper, for example, doesn't have Ray McGuire singing anymore, or Brian the guitar. I don't think he's with the band anymore. It's a bit weird because you're not
Yeah.
getting what you paid for.
When during the course of your research for this program, and the latest is called Uncharted: Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. Give me a couple of examples of things that you came across that blew you away, where you were like, "Wow, this is really creepy," or "This is just stunning."
Well, the Bob Marley assassination story is fascinating because
Yeah.
he was a political force in Jamaica.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I heard was that there was a failed assassination attempt. He escaped with a bullet wound in his arm. And one of the stories I heard was that he and another member of his entourage were invited to some place in Trenchtown, Jamaica, to witness a lynching of some of the people responsible for the assassination attempt. So
Wow.
he would have seen retribution being doled out. This is the story. And the story goes on that even though this was a failed assassination attempt, there's a conspiracy theory that follows Marley through the rest of his life that involves the CIA infecting him with a very fast metastasizing cancer in his big toe that was created when somebody from the CIA gave him a brand new pair of Converse sneakers with an infected nail that was designed to go into the toe. And as a result, the toe became cancerous. It spread to his liver and his brain, and then he died. And the CIA
But
killed him.
did he not refuse traditional medicine and traditional
He
care?
did. He was a Rasta, and the quickest way to solve this particular problem would have been to amputate the toe, but he wouldn't do that. He opted for a skin graft instead, which did not work. It was a very rare form of cancer. It's a genetic. It's got a genetic component. There were people elsewhere in Marley's family that had this, so the idea of it being infected by a poisonous nail is crazy. But yeah, he refused. And then what he also did was when traditional medicine didn't work. He was at the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute in New York. When that wasn't working, they were going to send him home to die. But then there was somebody on staff that suggested this holistic clinic in Switzerland that employed natural and call it alternative medicine treatments. And it probably extended his life by 6 months. But by that time, the cancer had metastasized so much in his body that he was doomed.
What about the tragic death of Ricky Nelson? He died in a plane crash. But the stories I'd heard was he was freebasing, and the plane caught fire.
This is what I'm going to have to investigate. I have heard that too.
You have, okay.
Yes, I mean there are. It used to be that there were a lot of musicians who died in plane crashes.
Yeah.
You know, Jim Croce, Otis
Redding,
Redding, who else? Patsy
well, Buddy Holly,
Cline,
obviously.
the Big Bopper, Buddy Holly, and Richie Valens in 1959. So yeah, oh, the Leonard Skinner guys. So
Yeah.
this is I'm going to have to check out the Ricky Nelson story. I have heard that.
Yeah. That's a weird one. I'm looking forward to hear it too. To listening because these are all. I'm not a conspiracy theorist guy, but I believe that in many cases the stories that we hear are not the complete story.
Well, that's the point. For example, let's talk about Led Zeppelin. 1976, they're playing an American tour. They finish up with 3 shows at Madison Square Garden. This was the Wild West of the music industry, and a lot of money, a lot of transactions were done in cash. So Peter Grant, the manager of Led Zeppelin, had about $200,000 in cash in a safety deposit box at the Mercer Hotel in New York City. Sometime while Led Zeppelin was on stage during the final show, that $200,000 disappeared from that safety deposit box, and
Wow.
it was the biggest hotel theft, remains the biggest hotel theft in the history of New York City. No one has ever been held responsible. No one has ever been caught. And the thinking is that Peter Grant stole the money himself, but not for reasons that you might think. At the time, the tax rate in the UK was really, really high, and a lot of artists opted to move out of the UK on tax exile. Rolling Stones were the most famous example. Led Zeppelin didn't want to leave London, so they had to figure out a way to protect their money the best way they could. And the thinking is that Peter Grant somehow managed to take this $200,000, put it into a false bottom suitcase, and take it back to the UK past customs without having to pay tax on it. That's the theory.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a good theory to me. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was the first or the last
Absolutely.
member of the musical community to do that. Because I recall not long ago when Aretha Franklin was performing, and I don't think I'm talking out of school, but when she was performing for the mayor's gala, for Hazel McCallion's gala, she wanted to be paid up front, cash.
She was her and Chuck Berry. If you didn't have a bag full of cash waiting for me, I'm not going on. And Aretha often was seen with a purse on stage. That purse contained the money.
Now people think, well, that's so bizarre. Why would anybody think that way? And that, of course, stems from her early days and artists' early days when you had so many shysters who literally, you go to get paid and they say, well, I think you only gave about 80% of the performance that you should have, so I'm only going to pay you 80%. And at this point, you can't take back what you've already done on stage.
Right. And then occasionally those promoters or those bar managers or whoever would reach into the top drawer of the desk and put a 45 on the desk. So it's like, you're taking this much money, or there's going to be trouble. So yeah, I mean, Chuck Berry got ripped off a lot. Aretha Franklin got ripped off. I mean, tons of these artists got ripped, and there's so many stories about who these artists are, which I hope to uncover at some point.
And they're all getting ripped off today by the music streaming services.
Yeah, that's a complicated one because people tend to equate streams with sales, and they're two different things entirely. What people forget is that the streaming music services don't pay out as little as they do because they want to, because they're being mean, because they're being cheap. They pay out what they have to. That's negotiated with publishers, record labels, and copyright boards. So they're just paying out what they're supposed to pay out. The problem is that those payouts every month go into this big black box that's in between the streaming service and the artist. And that black box is controlled by publishers, record labels, and the copyright boards. And they dole out what the artist gets. Yeah. So it's kind of like if you're working at a job, every 2 weeks you go to the bank expecting that you're going to get this much money because you put in this much work. And the bank says, no, I think you deserve only this much. And that's what you get. The other thing that people don't realize is that companies like Universal and Sony and Warner have an equity stake in companies like Spotify. They own part of the company. So they're kind of double dipping in both ways. So they're controlling. The record companies are really upset that they still remember what it was like when they lost control of distribution when Steve Jobs came along with iTunes in the early 2000s. They had no opportunity and they had no knowledge of how to tackle music and the internet. And when Steve Jobs came and presented a solution, they had no choice but to take it. The record labels could not create their own streaming music service, couldn't create their own digital storefronts. This is before streaming, of course, because that would have violated all kinds of antitrust laws. So they had no choice but to take Steve Jobs and his iTunes as their distribution service. And that really hurt them. They never wanted to lose control of that. So now, by having an equity stake in Spotify, they control every aspect of the distribution of music and are making money from it. And they've also made sure that a company like Spotify will almost surely never be profitable, because the way it's structured is that as usage goes up, so do the costs associated. So, and there's never an opportunity for there to be any kind of efficiency, synergy, any way to increase profit margins, because the more money you make, the more money you pay out, and they go up in lockstep. So
Right.
there's a lot of the whole thing with streaming music is misunderstood, and
Yeah.
but that doesn't help any artists who aren't making any money.
No.
Again, it's another example of the music industry conspiring to take advantage of artists.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. And which brings about another point, because I know people have asked you, they said, well, listen, when you talk about all these different artists and whether it's the ongoing history of new music or your latest venture, Uncharted, why can't you play songs from these artists that you're talking about?
Oh, in the podcast,
Explain that, because it's confusing. I try to explain why I can't do it on my own podcast.
right?
It's so confusing.
It is. So when an artist signs a deal with a record company, that means the record company has exclusive right to distribute that music through all forms. If you put music in a podcast and you have that podcast distributed, well, then you're violating that exclusivity contract. You are distributing music as part of your podcast. So unless you pay for that privilege, you can't do it. The problem is that you can't pay even if you wanted to. There is no mechanism anywhere in the world, with the exception of one thing that Spotify does, that allows you to include music in podcasts. I can't tell you how much time I've spent on this. I would go to a label, or I would go to a publisher, or a performing rights organization, and say, okay, we want to include music in a podcast. How do we do that? What do we pay? Who do we pay? How much do we pay? And they go, well, there's no mechanism for this. Nowhere in the world is there a mechanism where you can pay for the privilege of putting music in your podcast. The only thing that you can do is Spotify has a tool for their podcast called Anchor that sort of allows you to do this. But then that ties your podcast just to Spotify, and you can't use any other distribution platform like Apple's podcasts or any of the other platforms. So it's a non-starter for an awful lot of people. And what's happened is that the number, somewhere around 15 to 20% of podcasts are about music. And we would love to be able to pay what we owe, but we can't. And the music industry realizes they're leaving an awful lot of money on the table, but they've never come up with a mechanism like a blanket license that would allow this to happen. So if I'm a podcasting network and say, okay, we have X number of downloads across our music podcasts per year or per month or whatever it is, let's work out a fee, what that would be. We'll pay this to a performing rights organization, and they can then distribute the money to the artists. That needs to happen, and it hasn't happened yet. So what we do to get around it is, well, we're not even getting around it, because it's technically illegal to play even a nanosecond of a copyrighted piece of music in a podcast. So we edit everything down to 10 or 15 seconds for demonstration purposes, and none of the labels have complained about that.
Yeah. So, and I think it's one of the problems as well as, radio stations here pay SOCAN in Canada.
We pay,
and
yeah,
SOCAN then takes that money and distributes it to the artists that are played on their radio
right.
station. But SOCAN only covers Canada. So now podcasts, somebody could be listening to this podcast in Toronto, and at the same time somebody could be listening in Moscow. And obviously the rights are not the same, if they even have rights there. And same thing with New Zealand, the same thing with South Africa, or wherever else it is. And how do you do a deal with all those different organizations? It's impossible.
Right. It took a 2-year musician strike back in the 1940s for the United States to come up with the blanket license so you could play any song on the radio, and then pay the performing rights organization for that privilege. That's what we need now. It's got to be a worldwide thing where everybody pays their fair share. It's because every country has their own performing rights organization.
That's right.
And multiple ones. I mean, we have 3 in Canada. We have SOCAN, we have the Canadian Music Reproduction Rights Association, and then we have the neighboring rights people. So there's 3 fees that Canadian radio stations pay for the privilege of playing music on the air. In the United States, there's BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC. And I think there's something else. Sound Exchange is another one. So there's 4 maybe in the U.S. Britain has their own. Germany has their own. Spain has their own. Everybody has a performing rights organization. As far as I know, even North Korea has a performing rights organization. So you have to get them all on board. And good luck with that.
Alan Cross, the original history of the ongoing history of new music, and his latest venture, Uncharted: Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. That's a bi-weekly drop, is it?
Yes.
And ongoing history is a weekly.
Is a weekly, except for the summertime when we use that opportunity to run repeats. Repeats on the radio, but then during that time we go back into the deep catalog and release older shows as podcasts.
And these are available everywhere you find podcasts,
including Spotify, but with no music. Yes.
Great chatting with you, my friend. I look forward to talking to you in the new year once we get a bit more information on the CFNY documentary.
I have seen this, what I think will be the second or third to last cut, and it's a real movie. Yeah, it's a real movie, Ted. You'll be really happy with it.
I'm looking forward to it. Alan, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure chatting with you.
Nice chatting with you too.
That'll do it for another edition of the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Thank you very much for joining us, and don't forget you can check out past programs by going to www.tedwallachin.ca. You can find our sponsors and links to our sponsors as well. Support them as they have supported us. We appreciate that. And while you're online, don't forget to fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. Have a great week.
The Ted Wallachin Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. The Ted Wallachin Podcast is produced by me, Becky Coles. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more information on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwallachin.ca.